Our first speaker today is Carlos Magdalena, a scientific and botanical research horticulturalist at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where he works to preserve critically endangered species. Carlos specializes in the cultivation of tropical plants and has been instrumental in efforts to conserve aquatic species. Today, he'll discuss the many facets of botanical horticulture.
So thank you very much for this brilliant opportunity to talk to you today. I would like to speak about some aspects that I encountered over my career in Kew Gardens for more than 24 years. And the first aspect I would like to speak is the display side of things, because we must not forget that Botanic Gardens, at the end of the day, we are a public garden. And even though we are not just amenity, because we do science, we sometimes, especially in large botanic gardens like Kew Gardens, we have millions of visitors coming through the doors, and they are an important part of our funding. Also, it's a very good opportunity to enthuse visitors about the importance of plants and why this is relevant to them. Another facet that botanic gardens usually have is the historical glass houses. This is important because it allows us to grow a wider range of plants, because it gives us a different kind of climatic conditions. So this is an image of the temperate house, which is one of the largest ones in Kew, and it grows plants which don't take the frost out in the UK, but still need the cool temperatures. Warmer than the temperate house is the palm house, and they are both from the mid-19th century. So this is another aspect that you can encounter in botanic gardens, which is the heritage aspect. They are from the Victorian area, but we also have other buildings, such as the Princess of Wales Conservatory, which is from the decade of the 80s. And in here, rather than that colonial or historical feel, we display the plants more in a kind of habitat like dry tropics, moist tropics, or collections of plants such as carnivorous, orchids, or ferns. This means that Kew Gardens, the size of a scientific and amenity garden, is also a kind of catalog of historical architectural buildings, which has some challenges, but also poses some opportunities. Besides the big magnificent glass houses, my favorite is the water lily house, which adds another element into the equation, such as the seasonality of maybe the activities that you display. Because we don't have enough light during winter, we remove the water lilies, and then we open it every March, and then it's a very kind of explosive display, because you can see in one of the pictures when we plant the Victoria, late March, and then 6 weeks later, you have this incredible, glorious display of Victoria. Victoria is a kind of plant which has a lot of importance in the history of Kew, because it was about to be defunded when some botanists in Kew named it for the Queen Victoria, and then display the plant. So therefore, there was herds of visitors coming. So therefore, the funding continued in the organization. But an interesting aspect of all these displays is that it requires a behind the scenes nursery. Even though the building is not so interesting because it's an industrial building, it's one of the most biodiverse places on Kew. We have more than 10,000 species. You can see there, for example, moist tropical plants, aquatic plants, not only freshwater plants. At some point, we have a program to grow seagrass, so we grow marine plants too. In the other end of the spectrum, you have succulents, orchids, and then these collections have the downside that they are very high maintenance. You try to have basically a jungle order A to Z. And then when you try to grow things like tropical climbers, which grow like 25 centimeters a week, then, you know, you don't keep an eye on them for 2 weeks and the whole thing becomes very messy. This is another aspect, which is the kind of how you organize this, how do you locate all these plants, how you label all these plants, how you database all of this, but then they have a lot of opportunities. One of them being scientific research, like, for example, we cultivate more than 200 species of passiflora. And then that means that if you want to do a research on, for example, composition of nectar over the course of a single month, you can get maybe samples from 30 or 40 of those because they have gone flowering rather than having to travel to the country of origins and trying to find them flowering. And then you already have these plants verified. Then if a plant which is endangered happens to appear for cultivation, then you always have expertise behind which know how to grow these collections. Another aspect which is quite important of these collections is that we provide training for botanical horticulture. So we have the key diploma on botanical horticulture, which runs for 3 years, and it has a practical and academical component to it. But we have other type of kinds of training programs like traineeships, internships, and so on. One aspect which I am very fond of is propagation. You can only maintain these collections in pots and in small sizes or in the glass houses because very often they reach the roof and then you need to get a smaller version of this plant. Is the propagation, which I have been always very keen. Talking about training, I was an intern at Kew when I got obsessed with this beautiful plant from Rodriguez Island, the Café Marron, which this species was declared extinct in 1980s. But then very soon after the declaration of extinction, a schoolboy found the last plant. He was encouraged by his teacher to look for rare plants, and he came up with a branch of this plant. Then a cutting was taken to Kew, this was rooted, and then from this plant, we rooted many more. But then during more than 20 years, it never produced a seed. So he joined the category of the living death, the plant that you could never get back into the wild because it cannot reproduce itself. I got quite obsessed with this, and I am happy to announce today, many years later, that I managed to produce a fruit, which you can see one of them there. But more interestingly, it was the juvenile form of the plant that the science never had recorded, which is these plants with small, long, narrow leaves. At the time, some people didn't believe me that I was talking truth. They thought I was growing something else. But as you can see in this image, in this corner, once the plant gets about 1.20 meters, it automatically changes. And this is an interesting natural history is because there was a now extinct giant tortoise, and then the plants changed at the same height of the neck of the tortoise. This is experiencing many different families in the island. You can see here pictures from Combretaceae, Rubiaceae, and 80% of the plants in the island do this. So Ramosmania was no exception. It's just that we haven't seen it yet. But an interesting aspect was that because sexual reproduction has been achieved, then the seedlings came up in 2 different forms. One of them, a form which we didn't know it exists, was the female in the big picture in the middle, which has stigmas that poke above the anthers, which don't contain pollen, and is a functional female. And the other half came like the mother-father plant, which was the last specimen left. So that enables us to reintroduce it back into Rodriguez Island. We sent several plantlets and then many hundreds of seeds. And then you get there thinking that you have fixed something, and perhaps you have, but then you find that the island has 350 other critical endangered plants, most of them with less than 10 specimens. So I also used the chance to bring some other spectacular plants into cultivation, like this Eleocarpus boyeri, the lace tree, which was known with 3 specimens, the coral tree, which have less than 12 specimens left, or taxonomical oddities like Rosea simplex, which is a genera which has only 1 species and is pollinated by gecko lizards. And it's one of the only plants that we know that has the same pollinator as a seed dispersal agent, which is a kind of evolutionary oddity, if you like. Going back with training, we can provide training in the botanic garden, but also we can go out there and train local communities. A case will be, for example, the Brazil nut. This is a very important economic crop in northern Bolivia. And it was quite shocking to me to find out that there was not a single protocol about how to propagate this. And then I was brought to Bolivia to train local communities because basically this Brazil nut can be only be harvested from the wild because out of the natural range, the pollinator doesn't pollinate the tree, and then they are extremely tall, so pollinating by hand is not an option. So it was quite shocking to me how to touring in a few little villages, and with a little bit of plastic and some wire and a knife, you can teach local communities to grow their own economic crop, and in the process restoring the natural habitat rather than destroying it. The same type of activity I was lucky enough to do in a totally different climate, but in Peru, in the desertic areas of the coastal Peru. This tree is a very interesting tree. It's one of the only trees capable of producing shade and grow because they have one of the deepest root systems on the planet. They go down to 70 meters deep and then tap in the phreatic water that comes from the Andes. And then it has been cut massively because the wood is very hard and it's very dense and it has a lot of calorific effect, and it was used mostly to roast chickens. So we again have these projects which establish nurseries in there so they could propagate these trees. And then while you go there to teach, you can also go there and learn. And these trips are excellent opportunity as a horticulturist for you to learn about plants which are very iconic or very interesting for displaying in the garden, such as this Puya Raimondi, which you don't really see the sheer size of this plant by looking at this picture. This one, maybe put it a bit more in context. This is a plant which has been burned after flowering. One of the local people joke about the fact that this looks like the mascara eyebrows of Pachamama has been dropped into the Andes, which was quite hilarious. And in the other end of the spectrum, you have such iconic plants as Victoria, which I will talk about this a bit later. But following the topic of water lilies, one of the places where I've been collecting extensively is in Australia, which maybe 30 years ago there was about 5 species, but now we look at more than 22. And they are all placed in the kind of very north end of Australia, which is the most tropical one. And this is a place where there is less botanic gardens and less scientific facilities. So I was brought in by local scientists from Perth Botanic Garden because they want to do a project about seed storage of these species, and they were finding quite difficult to identify the species because they found like many different intermediate forms, because things like hybridization happen. Like you can see here, you have in one end Nymphea violacea and then Nymphea macrosperma in the other one, and then the hybrid right in the middle. So this is quite easy to see when you have both species in the field, but when you just have one and maybe perhaps the parents are not present, it complicates the things. The taxonomy has been quite cryptic because there are species like Nymphea violacea, which are widespread everywhere. And then there are similar species, which if you look in detail, they are very different, but they are easily confused, like this Nymphea lucae, which was described perhaps in the last decade and a half. Sometimes you get species being described, like this Nymphea kimberleyensis, which is turning up that is probably a hybrid, as is sterile, and perhaps one of the parents is this Nymphea lucae, which was not previously described when this one got described. One aspect that I also had to experience by doing botanical horticulture is overcoming your fears, like your fear of flying in helicopters, especially if this was done with the help of local Australian farmers, because they can get you to really remote places where there is no roads, like this Lake Louisa, in just 1 hour rather than you having to travel and walk for days. While this picture sounds quite idyllic, looks quite idyllic, and it looks very peaceful, you go to a location called Normanton trying to collect a very rare water lily, and you will receive in the entrance of the town by this, which is a replica of a crocodile which was taken from the lake. I wanted to collect this Nymphea alexi, which is a spectacular species and only lives in there, in a couple of lakes, and one of them has been already split by a high road. So there is this thing of thinking like, should I get in here or should I leave it behind and face the extinction of this thing, and then I have a chance and I didn't make it. So today I'm happy I did it because I didn't got eaten by a crocodile, but the species is truly incredible. And interestingly, DNA has shown that this is one of the most distinctive at molecular level species of the water lilies from Australia. Talking about molecular, when you have extensive collections, more than 50 natural source collections of water lilies, you can have molecular studies, which you perhaps could have done with herbarium specimens. But then when you have the living collections, you can do things like chromosome counts and other things which are much easier done with living material. This added to collections from other genera we have in the collections was the foundation for the big tree of flowering plants, the paper we just spoke before, in which 637 samples were taken from the living collections, and pretty much the whole water lily clade, which is one of the early flowering plants, was made with living collections. Conservation in water lilies was not much explored until recently. In these pictures, you can see this small puddle in this corner. That is the whole known habitat for the species Nymphea thermarum, which we only knew about that population, and then there was 2 plants in Bonn, and they were very difficult to propagate. And I managed to propagate them by growing them very shallow, so the seedlings could be exposed to the CO2 of the air whenever they are born, and that was very successful. Very soon after, it was declared extinct, even though nowadays we have found another population. We published all of this. It was quite popular in some kind of media network channels, but then somebody went and stole one plant, and then the media went absolutely crazy with this. It got reported by most of the outlets, and then there was this allure of somebody has stolen something in the museum, and Scotland Yard investigates. The local Spanish media, where I'm from, ran a piece of an article picking up in my work. They make this caricature, and they call me El Mesías de las Plantas, the plant messiah. Soon after, David Attenborough came to Kew, because this is another aspect. For example, we have been collaborating with a lot of documentaries, providing plans for 10 labs, providing also ideas about looking at ecological tricks from plants, which could be interesting for audiences. And then he was filming with us for more than a year, a series on 3D, which was quite popular. And then when this thing got screened in the big screen in central London, I went there for the premiere, and then he introduced me to the audience as the plant messiah. Things went a bit kind of out of control with it, and I was listed as the 1,000 most influential person of London for 3 years, which got some interesting politicians coming planting water lilies in the collection, giving more visibility to the topic of water lilies and conservation of the dark, and I even end up welcoming people in Heathrow Airport with a water lily in my hands. So all of a sudden, that's another aspect. You get put in the eye of the media, and you think, what do you do out of this? So yes, you may have guessed it, I brought the book. And then this was published by Penguin England, but then I'm happy to announce that book that got published in 12 languages, including Chinese, Japanese, and pretty much any other European language, with the main message that we're about to lose 2 out of 5 species of plants. So that means that we will lose 100,000 plant species. Also, I always try to put an emphasis in any of my talks about why this is important to you and why plants are important to humankind as large, and why there is a massive risk on losing them. So here is an image that somehow summarizes biodiversity, at least in water lilies, which is, I am in the middle of the water lily house, holding the smallest water lily on my hand, and then there is the largest water lily on the world, which is Victoria, by them, Victoria amazonica. But there was a problem. The largest water lily in the world, it wasn't discovered yet. Victoria boliviana was introduced to science in 2022. It is one of the paths which is not one of the biggest ones we have. It was like 2.60 meters with a gardener for comparison. And then the interesting thing of this is that there was traces of this water lily, pictures and herbariums, and it was even botanical illustrations about it, which were made by accident, but it was hidden in plain sight. But once you cultivate it, it becomes quite obvious, at least to me. If you look at the top, is Victoria amazonica, and the 2 pictures show into that size, it shows Victoria cruziana when it's a bit younger, and Victoria boliviana. And then when they are a bit older, Victoria cruziana and Victoria boliviana again. So you can compare plants under the same conditions and conclude that this is something genetic rather than an environmental thing. So that, interestingly, even though I discovered this over watching pictures in the internet, I went back to Bolivia to kind of verify that all of this happens in the wild, because the only thing I knew about this plant was that it was being grown in a bar in Bolivia. So then I managed to talk to the people which collected it, went back into the wild and verified that it was the same plant and it wasn't something which just happened to be in cultivation. And then we produced a very interesting paper in which we match morphologies with pictures which we found over the internet, including iNaturalist, but not only, including Instagram, and then molecular research, as well as botanical illustration, which, even though it's a very old technique, is still a kind of relevant thing today, because you can see, as you can see in these flowers, anybody can really get a flower of Victoria, cut it in half and compare with this and know what they are looking at. We use other unsuspecting new technologies, such as Google Maps. So that keep me awake a few nights looking for water lilies in Google Maps, because if you put a satellite image, you can detect them. And then that help a lot to work out the distributions. And then matching all of this is how we make the paper. So this was the leaf that was used by the Guinness World Record, and then they put it down to Amazonica, but in fact it was Victoria boliviana. This was 3 meters stem, and it was 9 meters, almost 9 square meters in surface. This was Tonchi in a garden called La Rinconada. So then we had to re-homologate the whole Guinness record, and then we went for one and we ended up getting 2, because it's the largest water lily in the world, the largest single invertebrate leaf on the world. So it's quite amazing how one of the most fascinating plants and one of the kinds of iconic plants of botanic gardens, containing only 10, 2, now 3 species, was not discovered, even though it was right there for everybody to see, and you could even see it in Google Maps. Very often people ask me, what's the trick to put a kid on one of those water lilies? And the trick is to have a water lily and to have a kid, or perhaps a gardener. One thing which made me feel very proud, it was that this discovery of this species of Victoria and the scientific naming of it was an opportunity to display these plants in a different way. So we managed to grow the three species side by side, and then we put this interpretation, which contains the morphology of it, explaining to visitors what the difference were at many different levels, but also in the water lily house in the same year, we have all these Australian water lilies with also Victoria boliviana, and all around it there was all this interpretation, which is another aspect, explaining the importance of taxonomy, the importance of botanical illustration, the importance of botanical molecular work, as well as the importance of the paper which we just been publishing about the diversity and phylogenetics of the flowering plants of the world. And even though there was a lot of scientists working in this paper, I must say the most important thing was the gardeners. All of this started with four gardeners, myself in Kew Gardens, and then 3 local gardeners, an amateur gardener, which is an enthusiast of water lilies, like Cesar, Tonchi, which has an amenity garden in Santa Cruz, and then the staff from Santa Cruz Botanic Garden, which kind of financed me to do this trip. So in that note, I just want to say thank you very much for bringing me here and to be able to explain to you all these details of my career. Thank you.
Questions?
Carlos, we have a question online.
Okay.
So Julie writes, first of all, she compliments how beautiful the Kew greenhouses are and says, have you been confronted recently by maintenance projects where you have to close them for public while maintenance is being done? And how is that done?
Sorry?
So maintenance for the greenhouses, when you close them for the public, how does that occur? Are the plants treated well, and how does that work?
Well, sometimes unfortunately we have to close them to fix some areas. So then basically when something is not safe, like a glass pane or something like this, we have to close it. Interestingly, the biggest problem with this is when, you know, the temperate house and the pearl house, they have been there for more than 150 years. So we had to close the temperate house for more than 4 years to restore it. Then we had to get all the plants out. We had to propagate everything. Then we had to restore the whole building. Then we had to bring the plants back. We are about to do the same with the pearl house. It's just like a question of life or death. Basically, if you don't restore the building, then you cannot keep it going. So we try to keep it open as much as we can. And interestingly, Kew Gardens is only closed for 1 day a year on Christmas, and the rest is usually open. But this is interesting because we never close all the glass houses. So there is so many, and then there's a kind of added value to have a set of different glass houses. There may be one which is under refurbishment, but then there is always some other collections that you can see. One more.
This is just about your biography. Paulina wants to know where you are originally from.
Where I am from, if nobody has guessed by my accent, that is Spain, and I am from Asturias in the north. So it's a very rainy part of Spain rather than the typical dry area.
Well, we will have some additional time for questions.
Yeah.
Q&A at the end. And so I guess we can move on. Thank you.